August 25, 1944. The Norman hedgerows still smoldered with the ash of recent battle. Dawn broke across the French countryside in shades of copper and gray, casting long shadows over roads cratered by artillery and lined with the skeletal remains of German Tiger tanks. In a makeshift depot near Chartres, American Lieutenant Charles Stevenson stood before a column of 2.5-ton GMC trucks that stretched beyond the curve of the horizon. The engines rumbled in unison, a mechanical thunder that drowned out the distant pop of small arms fire. Drivers, black soldiers from the 3207th Quartermaster Truck Company, adjusted their goggles, tightened their gloves, and waited for the signal. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with summer wheat. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 7 times, marking not the hour of prayer but the beginning of another run. 350 miles to the front lines. No stops. No sleep. Just asphalt, speed, and the weight of an army on their backs. This was the Red Ball Express. The war in Europe had reached a tipping point that summer. Operation Overlord, the massive Allied invasion of Normandy launched on June 6, 1944, had succeeded beyond the most optimistic predictions. By late August, German forces were in full retreat across France, their once vaunted Wehrmacht collapsing under the relentless advance of American, British, and Canadian divisions. General George S. Patton's Third Army had broken through at Avranches and was racing eastward toward the Rhine at speeds that astonished even his own commanders. In just 3 weeks, Patton's tanks covered more ground than Napoleon had in 3 months. The Allies had liberated Paris. The German Seventh Army had been shattered at Falaise. Victory, it seemed, was no longer a question of if but when. Yet beneath this triumphant narrative lay a crisis that threatened to halt the entire offensive. Supply. Modern mechanized warfare consumed resources at a staggering rate. A single American armored division required 300 tons of supplies per day: fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment, spare parts, and more. Patton's Third Army alone needed 800,000 gallons of gasoline daily to keep its tanks, trucks, and jeeps moving. The problem was not abundance but distance. Allied supply lines stretched back across hundreds of miles of French countryside to the beaches of Normandy, where material still poured ashore from Liberty ships and LSDs. The ports of Cherbourg and the artificial Mulberry harbors could barely keep pace. Rail lines had been destroyed by Allied bombing and German sabotage. The front was moving faster than the infrastructure could follow. Enter the Red Ball Express, an improvised convoy system that would become the largest logistical operation in military history. Named after railroad terminology for high-priority freight trains, the Red Ball routes were marked with red balls painted on signs along designated highways, reserved exclusively for military traffic. Beginning on August 25, 1944, thousands of trucks ran day and night along a circular route from the Normandy depots to forward supply dumps near the front. Then back again, a continuous loop of motion that defied every conventional notion of logistics. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks, employed over 23,000 personnel, and delivered 12,000 tons of supplies daily across a network that eventually spanned nearly 4,000 miles of French roads. The Germans had mocked American logistics for years. In the officer clubs of Berlin and the staff rooms of the Wehrmacht, American supply doctrine was treated as a punchline, evidence of a soft, materialistic nation that confused abundance with competence. German military culture revered the warrior ethos, the aggressive spirit of the lancer, the common infantryman who advanced with rifle in hand, grenade regardless of odds. Supply concerns were secondary. The German army had conquered most of Europe with horse-drawn wagons still comprising the majority of its transport. Even at the height of the Blitzkrieg, 80% of German supplies moved by animal power. The German soldier marched on foot and prided himself on endurance. He ate black bread and ersatz coffee and considered it a virtue. American troops, by contrast, seemed to carry entire department stores on their backs, fresh uniforms, candy bars, cigarettes, even recreational equipment. To German eyes, this was decadence, not strength. General Hans von Luck, a decorated panzer commander who fought across North Africa and France, later wrote in his memoirs about the moment he first understood the depth of American logistical power. It was not on the battlefield where the revelation occurred, but in a moment of stillness, watching through binoculars as American trucks crossed the Seine in an unbroken chain. "We had been taught that the Americans were shopkeepers playing at war," he wrote. "But shopkeepers understand something that we did not. That war is not merely about the courage to die but the capacity to sustain." Von Luck watched those trucks for 3 hours. They never stopped coming. He counted over 800 vehicles before he lowered his binoculars and accepted what he had been unwilling to admit. Germany could not win a war of material against such abundance. But the Red Ball Express was more than an exercise in moving cargo. It was a social revolution disguised as a supply line. Of the roughly 23,000 men who drove for the Red Ball, approximately 75% were African American soldiers serving in segregated units. The U.S. Army in 1944 remained deeply divided by race, with black soldiers largely relegated to service roles, stevedores, cooks, truck drivers, deemed unworthy of combat. These men had enlisted to fight fascism only to find themselves fighting prejudice within their own ranks. They were paid the same as white soldiers but treated as inferiors, denied opportunities for promotion, subjected to Jim Crow policies even on European soil. Yet when the crisis came, when Patton's tanks were grinding to a halt for lack of fuel, and the German counteroffensive threatened to stabilize the front, it was these black truck companies that stepped forward and kept the army moving. The drivers of the Red Ball worked under conditions that bordered on the inhuman. Each run from the Normandy depots to the front covered between 300 and 400 miles, depending on the shifting battle lines. The roads were narrow, pitted with shell craters, choked with rubble from bombed-out villages. Convoys moved at 35 miles per hour when conditions allowed, often much slower. Drivers worked shifts of 20 hours or more, grabbing sleep in 15-minute intervals at checkpoints or while their trucks were being loaded. The trucks themselves, mostly GMC CCKW 6x6 models, were sturdy but unforgiving machines. They lacked power steering, power brakes, and shock absorbers. After 10 hours behind the wheel, a driver's arms felt like lead. After 20 hours, hallucinations set in, shadows on the road that looked like children, phantom intersections that didn't exist. Men tied their eyelids open with string. They chewed coffee grounds to stay awake. Some drivers rigged small bells on strings attached to their fingers so that if they began to doze, the slackening hand would ring them back to consciousness. The danger was constant and multifaceted. German aircraft still prowled the skies, targeting supply convoys with strafing runs and bombs. Luftwaffe pilots knew that destroying a fuel truck was as valuable as destroying a tank, perhaps more so, since a tank without fuel was just immobile steel. The Red Ball routes became hunting grounds. Drivers learned to watch the skies, to listen for the distinctive whine of a Focke-Wulf descending. When the alarm came, a shout, a whistle, the sudden scatter of birds, they had seconds to abandon their trucks and dive for ditches. Many didn't make it. The official casualty figures for Red Ball drivers remain incomplete, but records indicate dozens killed and hundreds wounded, not from enemy action alone but from accidents. Fatigue-drunk drivers missed turns and plunged into ravines. Overloaded trucks lost brakes on downhill grades and jackknifed into oncoming traffic. Convoys moving at night without headlights, blackout conditions to avoid detection, collided with each other, with civilian vehicles, with French resistance fighters moving supplies of their own. One stretch of road near Alençon became known as Death Valley, after 17 trucks wrecked there in a single week. And yet they kept driving. Private Horace Evans of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company later recalled the strange pride that developed among the drivers, a sense that they were doing something historic even as they lived through its grinding reality. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes," he said in a 1984 interview. "We were just trying to get the job done and get home. But after a while you start to realize, if we stop, the whole army stops. Patton can't move without us. Eisenhower can't move without us. The whole damn war comes down to whether we can keep these trucks running." That awareness changed how the men saw themselves. They began painting slogans on their trucks. "Hitler's Express, Berlin or bust. We deliver." They raced each other between checkpoints, competing to see who could make the fastest run. They sang while they drove, gospel hymns, blues, work songs from the cotton fields their fathers and grandfathers had labored in. The trucks became mobile churches, mobile juke joints, mobile testaments to endurance. The scale of the operation would have been impossible without American industrial capacity, a fact that German commanders grasped only too late. In the interwar years, while Germany had rebuilt its military in secret, and then in open defiance of Versailles, the United States had constructed the most productive economy in human history. American factories did not merely make trucks, they made trucks faster than any nation had ever made anything. The GMC CCKW that formed the backbone of the Red Ball Express rolled off assembly lines at a rate of one vehicle every 4 minutes. By the end of the war, American factories had produced more than 600,000 trucks of this model alone. The numbers staggered comprehension. The United States built 2.5 million military trucks during World War II, more than all other combatant nations combined. It produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 53,000 landing craft. It manufactured ammunition at such volume that by 1944, American artillery units were firing in a single day more shells than the entire U.S. Army had possessed in 1939. This was the reality that German officers found incomprehensible. They came from a tradition that glorified scarcity, that treated limitation as a spur to ingenuity and sacrifice. The German army had invaded the Soviet Union with barely enough fuel to reach Moscow, gambling that victory could be achieved before the last drop burned away. It was a strategy born of desperation posing as daring. American logistics operated from the opposite philosophy, overwhelming abundance applied with ruthless efficiency. An American infantry division did not advance until its supply lines were secure, its depots stocked, its trucks fueled and ready. This approach struck German commanders as timid, even cowardly. But it was not timidity, it was mathematics. The Americans had calculated that victory belonged not to the side with the most courage, but to the side that could outlast, outproduce, and outdeliver its enemy. The Red Ball Express was the proof of concept. The symbolic heart of the Red Ball was not the truck or the driver or even the supplies themselves, but the road. Those designated highways marked with red balls, cleared of civilian traffic, maintained by Army engineers who worked around the clock filling craters and repairing bridges. The roads represented something that the German Army, for all its tactical brilliance, had never truly understood. That logistics is not a supporting element of war but its foundation. You cannot outmaneuver an enemy who can replace his losses faster than you can inflict them. You cannot intimidate an opponent who knows that for every gallon of fuel he burns, 100 more are already en route. The German military had been built on the concept of the decisive battle, the Kesselschlacht, the encirclement that would shatter the enemy's will and end the war in a stroke. The Americans had no interest in decisive battles. They preferred grinding, relentless pressure backed by inexhaustible supply. It was a philosophy that did not fit on propaganda posters, but it won wars. Lieutenant Stevenson, standing before his convoy that August morning, did not think in such grand terms. He thought about axles and tire pressure, and whether the fuel depot at Chartres had received its shipment of 10-in-1 rations. He thought about the sergeant who had collapsed from exhaustion 2 days prior, and whether the replacement driver was experienced enough to handle a fully loaded truck on those narrow roads. He thought about the intelligence report that morning mentioning increased Luftwaffe activity near Le Mans. But mostly he thought about the numbers. 350 miles, 12 hours if everything went perfectly, 18 hours if it didn't, 20 tons of ammunition and fuel per truck, 40 trucks in his convoy, 800 tons total, enough to keep a regiment fighting for 3 days. It was always about the numbers. War reduced to arithmetic. The transformation in German attitudes toward American logistics did not happen all at once. It was a gradual awakening, a dawning horror as the implications became clear. In the weeks following the Normandy invasion, German intelligence officers had dismissed the Allied supply buildup as a temporary surge, impressive but unsustainable. They expected the offensive to stall as it had in Italy, where narrow peninsular geography and determined German resistance had slowed the Allied advance to a crawl. But France was not Italy. The roads were better, the countryside more open, and the American supply machine operated at a scale that defied every historical precedent. By September 1944, German frontline units were reporting that American forces seemed to suffer no shortages whatsoever. Captured American soldiers carried rations so abundant they could afford to give food to German prisoners. American medics had so much morphine they used it liberally, even for minor wounds. American infantrymen discarded equipment rather than carry it, helmets, canteens, entrenching tools, because they knew replacements would arrive within days. This was not the behavior of an army under strain. This was the behavior of an army drowning in plenty. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as chief of staff for several panzer armies on the eastern and western fronts, later wrote extensively about the American logistical advantage. He noted that German units, even in victory, were slowly being worn down by attrition they could not replace. "We could win a battle and lose the war in the same breath," he observed. "Every tank we destroyed, the Americans replaced within a week. Every tank we lost was gone forever. We fought knowing that time was against us, that each engagement, win or lose, brought us closer to exhaustion." Von Mellenthin described watching American truck convoys through artillery scopes, counting vehicles until he lost track, then estimating based on the length of the column. He calculated that in a single day, more American trucks passed through one French village than the entire German army possessed on the Western Front. "We could fight the Americans," he concluded. "We could not fight their trucks." The drivers of the Red Ball Express understood their value in a visceral way that transcended official recognition. They saw it in the faces of infantry soldiers at forward depots who greeted each convoy with cheers and backslapping gratitude. They heard it in the radio chatter from tank commanders who reported resuming their advance thanks to fuel deliveries. They felt it in the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that men's lives depended on their ability to stay awake, to keep driving, to deliver the goods no matter the cost. Private Willie Johnson of the 3257th Quartermaster Truck Company described the moment this understanding crystallized for him. It was late September, and his convoy had been delayed by German air raids for 6 hours. When they finally reached the depot near Metz, they found an armored regiment waiting in idled tanks, nearly out of fuel. The regiment's commanding officer, a white colonel from Virginia, approached Johnson's truck and shook his hand. "You boys just saved a lot of lives," the colonel said. Johnson was stunned, not by the gratitude but by the fact that it was offered at all. A white officer acknowledging a black enlisted man as essential, not expendable. "That's when I knew we weren't just drivers," Johnson said. "We were soldiers, and maybe for the first time the Army knew it too." But recognition came slowly and unevenly. The Red Ball Express was never intended to be permanent. Army planners viewed it as a stopgap measure, a way to keep the offensive moving until the ports of Brittany could be captured and the rail network restored. The assumption was that once Cherbourg and Brest and Saint-Nazaire were operational, normal supply channels would resume and the truck convoys would stand down. But the ports took longer to capture and repair than expected. Brest held out until September 19, enduring a brutal siege that left its facilities in ruins. Even after liberation, the ports required months of work to return to full capacity. German engineers had demolished cranes, mined harbors, and scuttled ships in channels to deny the Allies their use. Meanwhile, the front kept advancing. By October, Patton was approaching the German border. By November, American forces were engaged in the Battle of Huichen Forest and preparing for the final push into Germany itself. The Red Ball Express, conceived as a temporary expedient, became a permanent fixture of the Allied campaign. The trucks kept rolling. The numbers told a story of almost mythological proportions. Between August 25 and November 16, 1944, 83 days, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies to the front. That figure is almost impossible to contextualize without comparison. 400,000 tons is roughly equivalent to the combined cargo of 800 Liberty ships, the standard American cargo vessel of the war. It is more freight than was moved by all forms of transport in France during the entire First World War. And it was accomplished by trucks, not trains or ships or any other established method of bulk transport. The efficiency was staggering. Each truck averaged 4 trips per week, covering 1,400 miles. Each driver averaged 90 hours of work per week, often more. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, cannibalizing broken trucks for parts to keep the rest of the fleet operational. Fuel consumption was astronomical. The Red Ball trucks burned more gasoline than Patton's entire Third Army during the same period. But the math was inexorable. The fuel spent to deliver fuel was worth it if the tanks kept moving. The Germans watched this spectacle with mounting despair. In the autumn of 1944, as the Western Front stabilized briefly and both sides prepared for the final campaigns, German commanders took stock of their situation and recognized its futility. They were fighting an enemy who could absorb losses indefinitely, who replaced destroyed equipment faster than it could be destroyed, who seemed to possess not merely superior resources but an entirely different conception of war. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg and Inspector General of Panzer Forces in the war's final years, wrote with bitter clarity about the impossibility of Germany's position. "We had always believed," he noted, "that willpower and tactical excellence could compensate for material inferiority. The Americans taught us that this belief was a delusion. Willpower does not refuel an empty tank. Tactical excellence does not manufacture ammunition. We were fighting an enemy who had mastered the art of turning factories into weapons and highways into supply lines. Against such an enemy, courage was not enough." And yet the courage was real. The drivers of the Red Ball Express faced dangers that would have broken lesser men. Beyond the mechanical and physical challenges, beyond the enemy aircraft and the treacherous roads, there was the psychological toll of endless repetition. The same route day after day, night after night. The same checkpoints, the same towns, the same wrecked Tiger tank rusting by the roadside near Chartres. The monotony was its own form of combat, a grinding war against fatigue and boredom that had no clear victory condition. Some men cracked under it. They sat in their trucks and wept, unable to drive another mile. They went AWOL, disappearing into the French countryside. They took reckless chances, speeding around curves, running red lights at intersections, not from bravery but from desperation to feel something other than the numbing grind of the wheel. The Army established rest camps where drivers could spend a few days recovering, but the camps were always understaffed and overcrowded. Most men preferred to keep driving. At least on the road, they felt useful. The recurring symbol of the Red Ball Express, the image that captured its essence, was the jerry can, the 5-gallon metal fuel container that the Americans had copied from the Germans after discovering its superior design in North Africa. The jerry can was a marvel of engineering, with its 3 handles, its air pocket to allow for expansion, its sealed spout that prevented spills even when jostled on rough roads. It could be stacked efficiently, carried easily, and emptied quickly. The Germans had designed it in the 1930s, anticipating the fuel demands of mechanized warfare. But in one of history's great ironies, it was the Americans who exploited the design to its fullest potential, manufacturing millions of jerry cans, and using them to fuel the very trucks that outmatched German logistics. By late 1944, American supply dumps in France contained jerry cans stacked in pyramids 10 feet high, acres of fuel waiting to be transported forward. The image was potent. The German military's own innovation turned against it, mass-produced by American industry and delivered by black soldiers, whom the German propaganda machine had dismissed as subhuman. As autumn turned to winter and the Red Ball routes pushed eastward, the operation began to wind down. The ports were operational, the rail lines restored, the supply situation stabilizing. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations after 83 days of continuous service. The trucks were reassigned to other duties, the drivers dispersed to different units, the roads reopened to civilian traffic. There were no parades, no medals for most of the men involved, no official recognition of what they had accomplished. The Army was already looking ahead to the next crisis. The Battle of the Bulge would begin in just 3 weeks, demanding another massive logistical effort. But for the drivers who had lived through those 83 days, who had survived the crashes and the air raids and the bone-deep exhaustion, there was a quiet pride in knowing what they had done. They had kept an army moving. They had proved that logistics was not a supporting act but the main event. They had won a war one truck at a time. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond its immediate military impact. In the years after the war, historians and military analysts dissected the operation, seeking lessons that could be applied to future conflicts. The consensus was clear. Logistics had become the decisive factor in modern warfare. The nation that could move the most, supplies the farthest, the fastest would win. This understanding reshaped military doctrine around the world. The Soviet Union, observing American methods, poured resources into developing its own truck industry and supply networks. NATO planning in the Cold War centered on the assumption that any conflict in Europe would be won or lost based on supply lines, not battle lines. The Red Ball Express became a case study taught at military academies, a touchstone for discussions of sustainability and operational depth. But there was another legacy, quieter and more profound. The black soldiers who drove those trucks returned to an America still deeply segregated, still hostile to their aspirations, still unwilling to honor the service they had rendered. They came home to Jim Crow laws, to denied opportunities, to a country that had asked them to defend democracy abroad while denying it to them at home. Yet their service had planted seeds of change. The success of the Red Ball Express, the undeniable competence and courage of its drivers, became one more piece of evidence in the case against segregation. It would take years, decades, for that case to be heard fully, for the civil rights movement to dismantle the structures of oppression that the Red Ball drivers had confronted even while serving their country. But the connection was real. Every mile driven, every ton delivered, every moment of endurance under impossible conditions added weight to the argument that race was not a measure of worth, that talent and dedication transcended skin color, that the American promise of equality was not a gift to be granted but a right to be claimed. In the final accounting, the Germans had been wrong about American logistics, not because they underestimated American resources. They knew, or should have known, about the industrial capacity of the United States, but because they misunderstood what those resources represented. They saw abundance and assumed softness. They saw organization and assumed rigidity. They saw black soldiers driving trucks and assumed inferiority. Every assumption proved false. The abundance was strategic, the organization flexible, and the drivers possessed a discipline and determination that equaled any soldier in the German army. The Red Ball Express did not win the war. No single element wins a war, but it made victory possible. It proved that the boring, unglamorous work of moving supplies could be as decisive as any tank battle, that the clerks and drivers and mechanics were as essential as the infantry, that war in the industrial age was won not in moments of glory, but in hours of grinding, relentless work. January 1945. The war was entering its final phase. Allied armies stood on the German border, preparing to cross the Rhine and finish what had begun on the beaches of Normandy. In a supply depot near Liege, a former Red Ball driver named Sergeant Marcus Webb supervised the loading of trucks for the push into Germany. The convoys were smaller now, more targeted, but the principle remained the same. Keep the supplies moving, keep the army fed and fueled, maintain the pressure until the enemy could no longer resist. Webb watched a young replacement driver struggle with a load of jerry cans, trying to stack them properly in the truck bed. He walked over and showed the kid how to do it. 3 handles, air pocket up, spout to the side. The same lesson he'd learned 18 months earlier, the same lesson a German engineer had probably taught in 1938. The same lesson that armies had been learning since Alexander the Great, that battles are won by swords but wars are won by supply lines. The snow fell softly that evening, dusting the trucks and the roads and the sleeping men in their tents. Somewhere to the east, beyond the rivers and the forests and the fortifications, Germany waited in its final agony. Somewhere further east, the Soviet army pressed westward, grinding through Poland and East Prussia with its own massive supply lines, its own convoys of trucks, many of them American-made, delivered through the Lend-Lease program, more proof of the United States' logistical reach. The war would end in May after 5 more months of hard fighting, after rivers were crossed and cities captured and millions more shells fired. But its outcome was already determined. The side with the trucks had won. In the decades that followed, the men of the Red Ball Express would scatter across America, carrying their memories into civilian life. Some would speak of their service proudly, telling children and grandchildren about the time they drove through France with the weight of an army on their backs. Others would remain silent, the memories too hard or too complicated to share. The last thought belongs to the road itself, those highways marked with red balls, stretching across the French countryside from Normandy to the German border. The roads are still there, paved over and modernized but following the same paths. If you drive them today, there are few markers of what happened, few memorials to the 23,000 men who turned highways into history. But the roads remember. Every truck that rolls along them, every cargo delivered, every supply line maintained is an echo of that original effort, a testament to the unglamorous truth that wars are won not by heroes alone, but by the unheralded labor of men who simply refuse to stop working. The Germans mocked American logistics until they were buried under its weight. The joke in the end was on them. The trucks kept rolling, the army kept moving, the war was won. And somewhere in the vast machinery of history, in the endless movement of goods and people and ideas that defines modern civilization, the spirit of the Red Ball Express still drives through the night, lights off, engine roaring, carrying the weight of the world toward a destination it may never reach but will never stop pursuing. Because that is what logistics does. It endures, it delivers, it wins.